was quite taken by a book called The Best Catholics in the World, and the Irish, the Church, and the End of a Special Relationship by Derek Scally, who is actually the German journalist working, German reporting from Germany for the Irish Times. And he, the kickstart for this book was he wanted to look at why Irish Catholicism, in 20th century Ireland, or the late 20th century, 21st century, why what was happening in Ireland to Irish Catholicism. His own mother was from a small parish in Leitrim, and in that parish, growing up in Ireland in the 40s and 50s, if you had a priest or a nun in the family, your status in the community, went up. And in this particular parish of Derek Scally's mother, a man called Sean Brady became a priest, and that family was elevated in the community. He then became a bishop. Oh my goodness! So they rose much higher, and then he became archbishop. And but then there was a huge fall from grace after the reports on child abuse in the Catholic Church. So that was the kind of kickstart for Derek Scally writing this book, to reflect on what was happening in Ireland. He questions and explores why, up to relatively recently, we as an Irish society ignored the horrors that were happening in plain sight. Horrors that were revealed in the Ferns and Murphy reports of clerical child sex abuse, scandals of the industrial schools, of the Ryan report, the Magdalen laundries, the Tuam babies, and many other scandals of domestic violence and familial child sex abuse. The Catholic Church in Ireland up to the 70s and 1970s and 1980s was still quite powerful in Ireland. That was probably the pinnacle, was probably when Pope John Paul II came to Ireland, and over 1 million people came to Croke Park, or not Croke Park, to Phoenix Park, to hear Pope John Paul II. That was, in a sense, the pinnacle. And the Dublin Archdiocese, when the Archbishop McQuaid was Archbishop, it saw itself very much beyond the law. And they demand huge deference. The priests in the Irish parishes across the country, they held a lot of power, and they weren't questioned. And they demanded unquestionable deference. So, looking back at all of this, the ordinary people of Ireland, particularly Catholics, lacked for a long time any freedom to choose whether or not they would show deference or not, because the freedom to decide with ordinary people, particularly Catholic, it lacked for a long time, particularly after the famine. So, looking beyond the details of abuse and alongside the phenomenon of silence, there's often a common denominator of confusion. The legacies of the laundries often trigger a wrestling match in minds between guilt and shame. And Scally, I think, has a very interesting definition of shame, which I'd like to quote from the book. He says, "The simplest way I have found for differentiating guilt and shame is this: people feel guilt for what they have done, but they feel shame for who they are and how they are made to feel." And he uses the example of a religious sister who bullies a girl in a laundry. She infringed the girl's human rights and may feel guilty for what she has done. But the girl, who spent years there being told she was filth, will feel shame. Guilt is a wrong that can be righted by the wrongdoer. For example, you can pay a parking ticket, serve a prison sentence, while shame is what philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre called a hemorrhage of the soul. And I think there was so much of that in Ireland. Many in Catholic Ireland, for instance, had no control over structures and events, and thus feelings of guilt are correspondingly low. This is after the famine. Things were more complicated, and there was a collective shame. No one in Ireland wants to this, and I quote again from Scally's book. No one in Ireland wants to be made to feel guilty for abuses in Catholic Ireland if they had no means to change things, nor should they. But it is normal to feel collective shame at the ongoing negative effects of the negative events beyond their control or before their time. And he uses an example himself of when he was in the cinema watching the credits go up on the Magdalene Sisters, which was about abuse in the laundries. The laundries were not his fault, not his responsibility, he said, but I felt strongly that it was my shame. So Irish Catholicism pre the famine was very different for the ordinary people of Ireland. And it was much more in keeping with nature, with the seasons. Mass was said in people's houses. The priests were of the people. But there was, so then the famine happened. And people felt a lot of shame. So this was beyond their control, but they felt shame. This collective feeling of shame surrounded the famine in Ireland. And after the famine, Irish Catholicism changed radically. While Ireland's rural poor starved en masse, as Tom has so wonderfully demonstrated and explained to us, or emigrated, the aspiring middle classes craved respectability and modelled themselves on respectable Victorian ways. According to Joe Lee, who was an Irish celebrated historian, this mid-19th century Ireland was a sluggish society where envy, jealousy, and spite became rampant. And after a Catholic emancipation, which was in 1829, Catholics constructed facades of moral respectability behind which they obsessed over sex, the sin of sex, how best to control sex, and how best to deal discreetly with sexual accidents, make them disappear or emigrate. Tom mentioned a date in 1852. Well, there's a very big date in Ireland, and it's August 1850, when a synod of bishops was held in Thurles in County Tipperary. The gathering of 300 religious men came together with great pomp and ceremony, while the rest of the country was still feeling the aftershocks of the famine. The particular date in August 1850, at the beginning of this synod, there was such pomp and ceremony around it, with the bishops and their mitres and in their religious regalia. It was reported in the London newspapers, and the poor Irish in rags kneeling outside the gates. The man leading this synod was Archbishop Paul Cullen, who was credited with spearheading the development of a different kind of Irish Catholicism. And it was at this synod that the bishops made lots of changes. Among them, they voted against interdenominational education, which continues to cause problems for us in Ireland to this very day. In Cullen's 25 years from 1852 to 1878, religious orders opened up over 37 institutions, and among them were hospitals, schools, convents, and laundries. And after centuries of humiliation, the remodeled Catholic Church in Ireland offered promise and pride. Sadly, many of the old traditions began to fall away because there were so many new ones. It was much more attractive to go to the new church buildings with calendars of events and slated roofs than go to the holy wells in the rain, or have your local priest say mass in your house. Much easier for you to go to the church to mass. Under Cullen's Ireland's the Catholic Church, it moved quickly to fill deep-seated. This is trying to understand why this change came about. Now, I know this is a very brief analysis, but it's worth reflecting on. I think the Catholic Church moved quickly to fill deep-seated needs in the people for order, for safety, for pride, education, and economic security. This institution now offered the promise of status, salvation, and consolation in the desolation of post-famine Ireland. For famine survivors, what was offered to them after Thurles would seem to give them new hope. However, when the British failed with the stick, Paul Cullen succeeded with a carrot that was as much Confucian as Catholic. The Chinese philosopher wrote centuries before Christ, and I think this is really interesting. Lead them with excellence and put them in their place through roles and ritual practices, and in addition to developing a sense of shame, they will order themselves harmoniously. I leave it at that.